Good morning, everyone. We're just going to be waiting maybe until 11:02 to start this coffee chat, but I appreciate you joining us today again. We'll just give a few seconds until everyone has their computer connected to the Zoom conversation, and maybe if you I see still other people joining in. Perfect. So let me just maybe introduce Andrew right away. Andrew, how are you doing? It's a pleasure to have you today. Andrew is working for the Emerging Markets Investors Alliance, which is, if I describe it correctly, let's say a network of think tank and academic experts that encourage investors to improve the performance of their investment in the sustainable dimensions of extractive industry specifically, but maybe not only. Can I maybe just ask you, I'm just realizing that you made a very poor job of trying to introduce exactly what the Alliance was all about. Can you maybe just use the time just to introduce it yourself, and then we'll engage in further conversation, please? That'd be wonderful, Andrew.
That sounds great, Remy. I'm happy to do that.
Hey, Andrew.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Hey, I'm on as well. Just wanted to give you a heads up, Remy. Hi, it's Alex Schay.
Oh, yeah, Alex. So perfect. I wasn't sure Alex was joining us. So wonderful. So both Andrew and Alex actually work for the Alliance. If I'm not wrong, Andrew, would I be right by saying that you actually took the position of Alex just a couple of weeks ago? So that might be like a celebration coffee chat for the evolution inside the Alliance. Would that be right?
This is like perfect. This is perfect continuity. So and actually Alex knows a lot more about sustainable mining issues than me. So it's very good that he's on. But I will launch off here and just say a little bit about the Alliance. And firstly, thank you, Remy, for having us. I personally am a big fan of what you're doing with AMI and these calls, which I've been only quite recently, only a few weeks ago, was just introduced to these, but have found a lot of this to be very valuable for me as I'm learning all about the mining sector. And extractive industries, and in particular the webinar that you had last week, I believe, which was on just implications of COVID on community consent. That was super interesting. So well done on that. And yeah, we are very excited about partnering with you guys more. The Alliance is really best described as a not-for-profit group of former finance professionals. Well, we're still finance professionals, but we're former kind of mainstream Wall Street types. There are 8 of us who are working, but we have mainly based in New York area, but also we have an office in London. And essentially, we are all people who have gravitated towards the world of sustainability and ESG, having spent in my case, it was 20 years as a sell-side equity research analyst with Citi, looking at emerging markets. And so most of us have had some focus or another on emerging markets, whether it's on the buy side as a fund managers, or as in my case, and as Alex's case as well, more as an analyst. We have a few investment bankers as well who kind of all focusing on EM. And what this group is trying to address is the real gap that exists. There's a huge infrastructure of sustainability, ESG institutions. Is actually becoming quite a crowded space globally, but so much of that focus is really on the developed economies and developed market-based companies. And if you look at a lot of these, huge initiatives that you're hearing about, such as Climate Action 100+, Transition Pathways Initiative, what the PRI is doing, all of those are very much DM. And so there is not nearly as much in EM, and that's partially because it's been a lot slower for emerging markets companies and investors to really focus on ESG in the same way. But what it seems to me, just looking at this space now, is that a lot is happening right now in the EM world. Like, it's actually, if you were to talk to any average EM company, the odds are they're now publishing a sustainability report or an integrated report, but it's like the first year, or they've just they're redoing it now to make it much more comprehensive, et cetera. So a lot of new standards that are being introduced that are relevant to EM. So because of that, I think it is a great time to focus on this area. So we're trying to help investors, get up to speed and sort of get on top of these issues.
Maybe until, just before I pass over to Alex, in case he wants to complete the information that you actually suggested. the information that you just give. I just want to just use the time just to make my legal team happy, just to be able to read the disclaimer that we're supposed to be starting with at every single one of those coffee chats. So just sorry for this, bear with me. The opinions expressed by today's panelists are their personal views and may not reflect the views of the organization that they represent. Whenever possible, AMI has verified the accuracy of the information provided by third parties, but does not, under any circumstances, accept responsibility for any inaccuracies should they remain unverified. It is expected that webinar attendees will use the information provided in this webinar in conjunction with other information and with sound management practices. AMI therefore will not assume responsibility for commercial loss due to business decisions made based on the use or non-use of the information provided in today's webinar. So I know it was painful again to listen to my French accent just reading this, but I made a promise to my legal team, and the legal team is always, omnipotent in every single structure. So I'm just going to now turn to you, Alex, if that's okay. If you can just give us a little maybe additional information on the alliance themselves. And I know you have maybe I love Andrew, but you have a little more track record and history with the alliance, maybe explaining what you have done in the past, specifically with some of your partners, and how you can see the organization develop. All yours.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just quickly, Andrew gave a great summary of the alliance structure internally within an organization, but maybe just quickly, we're kind of a coalition of developing market institutional investors. So we're focusing on the PMs, the analysts, traders, salespeople, all involved in EM and FM markets. And we kind of work with those institutions that invest in public market securities, so not really a private equity focus. And that's public market securities across sovereign, corporate fixed income, and equities. And as Andrew mentioned, we're obviously a nonprofit, and we're funded by foundations, but our theory of change really involves educating investors who then address ESG concerns with their portfolio companies and governments. And obviously, we also do some direct advocacy with companies, and everything's structured through working groups. And Andrew heads up the extractors working group, which largely focuses on oil and gas and mining issues. So we also hold lots of conferences in New York and London. The last couple have been with BlackRock and BNP and AllianceBernstein. And really what we do often is highlight kind of ESG integration strategies that ostensibly are there to mitigate risk and gain kind of better insight into investments. And one thing I'd add to what Andrew said about that is really demonstrably now over the last 6 years, the data are very supportive that the corporate performance benefits, and therefore also the investment benefits of integrating ESG and EM are significantly better than DM. And that makes some sense given that you're in an environment in which institutions are weaker, the transparency, there's less transparency. So any additional insights you can glean about management and the like really are a benefit. And I think that's part of the reason why it's continuing to get significant traction in the industry, especially over the last 18 months.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alex. I just for the people listening, because you connected by phone, so we can't see your name. That was Alex Schay. He's also working with the Emerging Markets Investors Alliance with Andrew, and so that's the objective here is just try to. We've been working a lot on those different coffee chats, working on biosecurity protocols, working with mining companies that joined us and explained how they were facing the COVID-19 crisis. But more generally, I think one of the main reasons why we are developing those coffee chats is to continue our work in terms of helping sound projects, sustainable projects, at least the one that will create value in a mining territory, to gain that social license to operate. And by doing so, we've been working with mining companies and more with investors. And I'd like to turn to you, if that's okay, Andrew, in trying to explain how among the investors community and the ones that you interact with on a daily basis, how those perception of social license to operate and sustainability of investment, how has this evolved over the last, let's say, decades, and how do you engage with them on a regular basis?
Yeah, well, so first I would say that the ESG term, when you talk about sort of ESG investing, part of the problem with it is it is so broad. It encompasses so many different things. And so I'm going to get to your question, but I would start off, historically of the E, the S, and the G, so the environmental, the social, and the governance factors, G is probably the least unfamiliar. That's something that investors, especially in emerging markets, generally see as part of their job. It would be very unusual to have an investor who thinks governance is irrelevant. In EM, that's all the more case. So there isn't a whole lot of education involved around G, although there are institutions which many investors aren't so familiar with, which really can help understand governance, whether it's the various, ICGN, for example, which is a kind of governance, corporate governance network, or things like NRGI, National Resources Governance Institute, which is helping investors really be on top of how resources are being managed and where payments are going, for example, contract transparency. So there are institutions that can help investors, but it's pretty familiar. I think the second in the kind of hierarchy in ESG, in terms of the learning curve for investors, would be environmental factors. That's definitely something everyone is spending a lot of time on now. Probably that's the #1 focus at the moment, particularly carbon footprint, but also other environmental factors such as water, things like methane emissions, et cetera. There's a lot of issues, and there are a lot more to be done in that. I think that, getting to your question, is those social factors, which historically probably have been the least closely followed by investors. And honestly, as I was an analyst, the companies that I covered, these weren't extractives firms, so it's maybe slightly different, but still, if you're building a new factory somewhere, you're always going to have an understanding of what impact that has on your community. And I'm amazed to look back on that now and see how little emphasis there was from investors and from analysts, in the debate that we had with the companies on these types of social license issues. It just didn't come up very much. And I think that is what's changing now. And particularly, we're seeing that in the extractive space because you have examples of companies where conflict with the community has just, been a real problem. It's actually forced the closure or suspension of mines. And I'm sure you have folks on this call who will know many examples of that happening and kind of maybe can contribute some examples of how, companies can manage this better. But we actually had a speaker on our own working group call last week from Oxfam, Emily Greenspan, who's done a lot of work on this issue, and she was telling us about some research that mining companies can lose up to $20 million per week as a result of conflicts with the community. Looking at some of these these examples, and essentially, really, what is needed is this concept of FPIC, free and prior and informed consent, which obviously it's harder than it's just to say it. To actually do it is very hard. It involves engagement in a way that in many cases companies have not historically done. But the benefits of that can be massive in avoiding problems. And I think that investors are very much awakening to the importance of engaging with companies in FPIC. And the nice thing about that presentation was that Emily gave was she gave 5 kind of key points. Like these are just 5 questions that any investor should ask management for a mining or an energy company that is doing new investment, looking to open a mine. Have you done these 5 things? Do you have a process for explicit engagement with the community? Will you hold yourself to certain commitments, including gender diversity and other things? And that's something that investors have not been asking in the past.
No, I completely agree with you with your point, obviously, and it looks like we've been rehearsing that webinar and that coffee chat, because at the same time that you were speaking, we got a question from Luis Ore, who's working on the Warinsa project out of the company Solaris Copper in Ecuador. It's an interesting project, and I know they're developing an approach to community which is quite unique with the team, and he's indeed confirming that engaging effectively with local communities in order to work side by side to mitigate COVID-19 risks is one of the main elements and priorities for them. When we look at ESG, and if you want to focus on S indeed, how do you discuss with investors or with a lot of your partners on how to address the S indeed? I agree on the E and the G, and usually on E, I mean, they go through a series of third parties that are key experts in terms of being able to audit a company or be able to look at, tailings quality and other aspects. But sometimes they also outsource to the same team of environmental engineers the social element to it, which to me, and I'm a political science professor, you get a PhD to the topic. Yeah, I have to make the claim that is different. But to me, you can't really deal on social issues and working with alliances with the communities, and even specifically also working with key stakeholder at the regional level that sometimes finances those oppositions. How do you discuss with investors about this? And how can we make the point that it's not just another dimension of environmental risks, because putting communities as the environment of the mine is absolutely completely different. It's a totally different approach to be able to tackle those issues.
Alex, you want to take that?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. No, I think putting numbers to it is absolutely essential, right? And that's one thing. I was reflecting on this when Andrew was giving his really good summary there. The conference that Remi, that you and I attended in London at the end of last year, I think Rick Rule was reflecting on the industry and the amount of capital in it, right? So, the big pressing concern, and it was palpable among the corporates there, was how do we attract capital to this industry again? Even on the front end with the private equity, and even in secondary markets, the decline of generalist investors and the like has really, brought down volumes, in addition to obviously the commodity price issues and the like. But one thing that really was a consensus, a growing consensus, is that the understanding that investors are really looking at these ESG risks. And what Rick was saying is that, look, in the 70s, obviously, the capital was priced a little too cheaply. It was leveraged to commodity price increases. But now, he was asked flat out, is there sufficient level of capital in the industry? And he said, I'm going to disappoint a lot of people here by saying yes, because it is now reflecting the true risks that the investors face. And I think that realization among investors is certainly being communicated more and more to the companies. And like you say, Remi, look, these are engineering-driven enterprises. And my background is more oil and gas based, but I've ramped up with mining over the last 4 or 5 years. And the engineering approach to mitigating risk, getting the material out of the ground in an economically efficient way. I mean, these are tackling engineering problems. When you start talking about social issues and how to manage those, it's outside, let's say, the purview of really the main thrust of what companies are trying to do. So it's a bit out of their comfort zone. But again, back to the numbers. I mean, we did a report recently in which we aggregated all the incidents globally. So we looked at what Sustainalytics had collected in terms of aggregate incidences, ESG-related incidences globally related to mining. And if you stack together the community labor relations incidents, land use and biodiversity incidents, and water use issues, if you put those together and broadly put them in a category of stakeholder relations, those are the vast majority of the risks that mining companies face. And I think investors have now internalized that, and certainly you've seen that with tailings and limiting their exposure to upstream dams and demanding more engineering background on the construction of TFS facilities. But now the fact that's been internalized among investors, that these social risks are going to, like Andrew said, get permits pulled, halt operations. One of the biggest reasons on project execution risk, and not getting these on time and on budget are related to stakeholder concerns. And that immediately resonates with both investors and corporates.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, Alex, and I appreciate for your input here. I'm going to be circling back with some of the questions that were sent on chat, and some of them privately to me. Feel free to just send it to the entire group so that also Andrew and Alex can see them. There was one question specifically on how to address communities and the importance of addressing communities at the time of COVID-19. I'll just go very briefly on this because we have a series of webinar and coffee chats that are available on the LinkedIn page that we probably can send you the link. You can just download all the presentation and how obviously COVID COVID-19 is going to be having a strong impact on the rise of criminal organizations that are supplying masks right now, while the state sometimes cannot do it, or the mining company cannot do it. There's a lot of different protocols that need to be updated. I'm not going to go too much into details, but feel free to send me an email specifically, and we'll send you all the presentations and the webinar that we've done specifically on the 7 areas of risks above the ground risk, and how COVID-19 is going to be impacting economic, social, reputational, operational, political, I forget to in the list, but how the sound protocol that mining company can be actually using. I'm also, and that might be something of interest to you guys, it's a very interesting question I got on the question of water. And water is obviously a central issue for the mining community, and a central topic of conflict between communities and the mining company itself. The question was written as, do you think water is more of an E or an S? So basically, is it an environmental topic or a social topic? The answer to me is it's obviously both, but it needs to be assessed both from the environmental engineering side to be able to have sound data and information that then can be communicated with communities. If you don't have the scientific data, then you kept on a position which is on a passionate level and not into actual scientific facts. But then there's also obviously the social aspect to it, in which you have to be able to, bridge with those communities, find, agreements and compromises on both sides to be able to see what is the activity that a mining company would potentially put in jeopardy for another, neighboring business, whether it's a coffee grower, it's a flower industry, it's the rice industry, or whichever, but also trying to break, sound institutional structure and processes so that there's regular communication above and beyond the simple public hearing, but much more having a concerning way of being able to address a limiting resource, especially, let's say, in Peru, north of Chile, or other places. In Africa also, I'm sorry, I'm focusing on Latin America because I'm based in Miami, but there's also a lot of sites in Africa that would actually see the same protocols and strategy put in place. If I turn to you, Andrew, if you look at the question of, let's say, water, I'm sure that you've been working on water and extractive industries at the Alliance for quite some time. I had a virtual lunch with a common friend, Lisa Sachs, yesterday, talking about different issues, including how water issues and community rights should be evolving through COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 into virtual public hearing and others. But what is your perception on how the issue of water or key issues could be actually tackled by investors, and making clearly the signal that if there's no real agreement between communities and the mining company on water, therefore the project itself is going to be in jeopardy throughout the lifestyle of the project itself? Can I turn to you and maybe get your perception?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, firstly, one thing I want to say on COBE question, which is it would be very interesting. I don't know if anyone has been tracking just the different announcements and in the engagements that the mining companies have been doing with local communities on COVID, and what has been kind of the spectrum of responses. Because I haven't seen anything, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence kind of on both sides. Companies are making different efforts, but trying to kind of make some sense in these anecdotes and tame them into an actual picture and data would be really helpful. An example of where this has been being done effectively is in the garment industry. So there is I think it's called the International Workers' Route Foundation, basically a think tank out of Penn State University, where there's a group that is basically tracking all of the announcements by global apparel brands and how they are dealing with essentially their contracts that were in place pre-COVID that then, essentially had to be canceled or pared back or dealt with in the case of the collapse in demand. And there is a surprising range in how companies have responded. So you have sort of the H&Ms of the world that have been pretty good, essentially. They've agreed to pay for all work in progress, for example, even though they don't have to due to the terms of some of these contracts have force majeure contract, which allow them to be canceled. But they have a commitment to do that, and also then to pay for their suppliers for a certain period of time, et cetera. So there's that, and then there's the other extreme, which is actually a lot of the U.S. brands, which have been pretty fast to walk away from their commitments. And what is great about this project is it's been very kind of explicit and not afraid of naming and shaming who's doing what, and then investors can use that as a resource, you know, and informing their own strategy with owning these companies. So that struck me as like, that would be very useful to see that in the mining sector. It probably would be harder maybe to collect some of that data because it's quite local. It's harder to see compared with a contract. If it gets canceled, you can kind of see that. But anyway, so that's kind of a point I'd make on that. In terms of water, yes, it's absolutely true. I think, Remi, you did probably a better job than I could have in describing the way in which water really stretches across many different categories, you know, between E and S, and the very, very important role that it plays, both as just a key aspect of our environment, but also as a key exacerbator potentially of social disagreements when you have a community's water supply is threatened by a project, which often is what is happening. Then you have another element, because of course tailings, which is a specific mining issue, is a kind of a water issue of its own, you know, kind of a pollution slack, but there's a lot of water involved in those tailings dams. And so kind of is all encompassing. And I don't think there's any easy answer to the question you asked me, except just to say that any, firstly, engagement with the local community is a must. You know, that's something which just is not optional, and it needs to be prior. So it needs to be before any decisions are made. That's one of the points that Oxfam makes, you know, says, is that too often what you have is community engagement after you've already gotten the go-ahead on the project and actually shovels are already in the ground. And at that point, kind of what's, you know, your ability to negotiate is very constrained if those decisions have already been made. So that's important to do that beforehand, but also to very explicitly be willing to look at certain topics, and water probably is going to be almost always going to be at the first or one of the very, very top issues that you deal with.
No, absolutely. And I also wanted to rebound on something that you mentioned here. And that's something that we as AMI and the Global Alliance has in common, in the sense that we don't only operate into the mining sector or the extractive sector. We can actually take some base case practices or some solution that actually worked on something completely remote. And that sometimes, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of the mining companies, employees that work on community relation. It's hard for them because they're facing a lot of opposition. It's complicated to work on this, and sometimes they, because of the nature of the work and the structure itself, they're really narrow-minded into the mining projects and what has been done maybe on another mining project in the same country. Maybe in the best case scenario, trying to reach out to other jurisdictions. But what we can actually bring to the table is trying to see what has worked in other sectors and move forward into the mining sector, because there are some unique elements that can actually be very compatible. I'll just give an example. For example, we're working extensively, too much, I'm not sleeping enough lately, on the virtual public hearing question. And we're looking at virtual public hearings for such thing as the Zoo of Sao Paulo, for example, or some, you know, agreement on constitutional change in some countries in Africa, actually, that were, you know, discussed on the internet on some remote areas. And so those are, you know, case studies or case analysis that can be very relevant to analyze and support, you know, some mining companies that might be looking for a very unique way of addressing communities. One of the key elements, I think we agree, Andrew and myself, at least the kind of groups that we have in our network, is the fact that there can't be one solution fits all. It has to be obviously looking at one specific project and have a tailor-made solution. So that's why, you know, I always encourage it to look at the data of the project itself, to communicate with every single employee, or at least the ones that are regularly in relations with the strategizing towards community, to understand the perception, and then fit in indeed the kind of, you know, scenarios or processes or protocols that needs to be adapted. They can't be just replicated, but then really be able to address and talk to one or two key opposition leaders, trying to find what are the power, let's say, forces behind some of the stakeholders, what are the links between the region and the capital. Sometimes it can be antagonistic, sometimes there can be some real pressure impact on the zone of influence of the mining site. But once you understand those it's more than a stakeholder mapping, it's really understanding the dynamics behind it. Then you can actually sometimes, interestingly, bring in some solutions from outside. I want to talk about another specific issue before I go to some of the questions that were asked. I met with Alexander in London, and then with you, Andrew, a little later. We were talking about a series of indexes, whether it was the Responsible Mining Foundation index on the performance of different mining companies, with their limitation, there are some self-reporting impact into there. How do you actually see the impact of those indexes, and how they're followed by the investment community before they take the decision whether or not to support a mining company, or either take like a large portfolio position of shares into one of those junior miners, for example?
Alex, you want to take that?
Sure, or at least part of it, I guess. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'd say the generalized institutional investor awareness of RMF is low, and that's why we're here. That's part of our mission, to apprise investors of some of these indexes. RMF itself, yeah, they do scoring, but they purposefully made the decision not to do rankings, and for the sake of long-term engagement with the companies. So I think they're effective in highlighting obviously some specific ESG concerns that certain companies have, and as well as their progress. So they now have, I think they're in their third year of accumulating data, and they have 38 companies, and these are the biggest with the biggest globalized footprint. But I'd say, the investor community is less cognizant of that, and more focused, I'd say, on specific issues that can mitigate portfolio risk. Maybe just quickly on the mining, I just wanted to add, obviously on the water side, there's an intake issue, just needing so much water for cooling and lubricating equipment and transporting and processing of ore. And that obviously sets up issues with competitive use of water with agriculture and shared aquifers. But on the discharge side, on the effluent side, when you're dealing with either drainage water, water used in either, mining water in the extraction process, or drainage water that picks up all these harmful elements and then gets discharged into rivers and streams and the like. The Columbia Water Center, you mentioned Lisa Sachs at Columbia, but the Columbia Water Center, directed by Manu Lal, they've done some really interesting initiatives in conjunction with investors, and one particularly in Peru, in which they went on the front end of the process, in which they looked at the initial feasibility studies that were done. And a lot of those are really pro forma, a lot of boilerplate stuff. They're just a box checking exercise. But what he attempted to get done in Peru, and in conjunction with investors, was to do a more rigorous front end feasibility, in which they baselined what the local streams and rivers and tributaries looked like, so that down the road, statistically, they could look at discharge and the impact of mining operations in particular locations after having a baseline. And that was a really unique, kind of interesting way of approaching it, to put numbers to the issue. And I think it had a lot of potential benefit, but for various reasons, the political economic nexus in a lot of these countries makes that difficult. And but that's something I think it would behoove an organization like the Alliance to continue to try and focus on, galvanizing investors to do something with that.
Yeah, and I think that's an area which is very interesting, where we operate between the Alliance and ourselves, in the sense that we do have strong links with academia, different universities. I mean, some of us are university professors, others have very strong links with academia. And there's sometimes this perception from mining companies or real operators that, academic actors are from the ivory tower. They don't really have a link with the reality. And there's a need to be able to bridge with, this entire strong academic work that is being done on rights of water, on the use of lands, for example, on the processes towards permitting, the process towards public hearings, and where we, both the Alliance or ourselves, can actually translate it into something which is much more actionable for the companies themselves. There is a strong conceptual background, a strong, theoretical basis and protocol, but it has to be translated into a much more, let's say, business-oriented approach for mining companies. And I think both the Alliance and ourselves are doing this. There's also, I think Ana Lucia Santiago was listening, is part of a company called Volconic, which we might have heard, led by Kieran Moffat out of Brisbane and Melbourne. They actually do a good job also providing data. And the maybe kind of criticism that I have on this is that then you have to translate the data and entire, numbers I mean, I've seen the result that you could get from this, but you have to translate into some kind of human dimension. A lot of the opposition to mining projects are usually caused by qualitative issues rather than quantitative issues. They're caused by perception, they're caused by a lack of capacity to transmit a message which is based on scientific facts, and also an absence of trust that when actually you talk about the building together of a future for the mining territory, communities are not buying into this. But all these, from academia, when we're talking about Columbia University, we're talking about different centers, Volcanic or others, are a very interesting tools that need to be translated into the ears of the mining company to give them some ideas and perspective on how to move forward. I don't know if you want to add something to this, Andrew. And then
yeah, I mean, I would go back to the question on the RMF, Responsible Mining Index, and these other indices out there, and just it's really relevant to the whole question of data in analyzing sustainability, and it is very difficult. I think that's just the reality for investors. They're really struggling with the difficulty in getting and using this data which is available out there from various sources to make useful investment decisions. In fact, we've had some investors we've talked to have just come out and said they ignore all of the data providers, what they're saying, because it's just too low quality. It's too unreliable. And those, first and foremost, they're talking about the likes of MSCI and Sustainalytics. You also have Robeco Sam. So those are three main ones. Then you have about 3 or 4 other second tier providers of this ESG data. And it's not a criticism of those companies, because they're all, have really good people making a big effort, but just it is in reality quite hard to quantify things, and every company is different. We had this one case where we were doing an engagement with a Latin American food producer, and they were unhappy because there's a data provider called FAIR in the livestock industry, which is essentially rating companies. And they gave this company, a Brazilian meat packer, basically gave them a low rating. But when they couldn't understand why, we looked into it. It turns out they were getting hit because their disclosure on soy, it was being grown on deforested lands, was poor. They had poor soy disclosure. Well, actually, it turns out the company doesn't produce soy. They produce some other grains, but it's mainly a meat packer. So they don't have any soy. So of course they had bad disclosure on that. And once they clarify that with FAIR, their score, of course, went up. And you find that many of the companies who are engaging with responsible mining, also find that, frustration that on certain, factors, the questions being asked just aren't relevant to their business. And so they get dinged by this, quantitative model. And I don't think there is any answer, except that it is still early days for a lot of these, even for MSCI, and Sustainalytics. These approaches are evolving and getting more sophisticated, and I think you will have a better measures. Never perfect. You also, I think, will see some consolidation. So we're one of the things where if you have miners here, they probably will say, it's also very frustrating for the companies because they have so many different requirements in terms of disclosing, between SASB, GRI, some of the specific industry bodies, MSCI, Sustainalytics, and you get fatigue, and that also, creates quite a burden on them as well. So I think, for them, they'd prefer if they could just report just one or two and not 15. And I think over time that will get better.
Perfect. So Alex, if you want to say something, yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that was excellent. What I might add is that's precisely where the opportunity is, right? So if you look at it from an investor standpoint, the fact that the ratings are largely uncorrelated, unlike say the bond rating agencies, which move up and down largely. They're largely very correlated in their ratings because there's a consensus about what matters. Each of these ESG organizations are obviously weighting different things and thus have pretty disparate scores. And so buy-side investors look at that and go, well, what are we supposed to do with this, as Andrew characterized? But at the same time, that's precisely what opportunity is being created. So what we're seeing they're doing is they're pulling the analysis in-house. They'll take one provider, and then they'll come up with their own customized analysis. So the issue becomes how aggressive you want to be on that front versus how long you want to wait. And we've kind of joked about it internally. We've got some folks who are like, well, this is chaotic right now. We're just going to wait until, all of this gets normalized and standardized. And then we joke like, oh, well, okay, you're going to wait until this all gets completely efficiently priced into securities, right? And then it'll be impossible to outperform based on any of these factors, or significantly harder, right? So you get the joke, right? It's kind of it's a Wild West time, but it also presents an opportunity for investors who really want to dig into the numbers and see, oh, well, maybe this company is getting dinged for the wrong reasons.
Yes.
It'll eventually come out that that's not true. There might be an opportunity here, an investment opportunity, right?
Yeah, I mentioning those indexes. I've often criticized them. I'm on record for criticizing them. So I'm going to try to be more positive on this, in the sense that even if it's self-reporting and therefore it skews the different results, and there's came from the Fraser Institute report, or that's the same thing for some of those, sustainability indexes. It's still very interesting to have them because it forces company to actually address those issues. It's like if I were to ask my students to grade their papers, obviously they will all put themselves between an A+ and a B+, but at least they will not be able to answer that, they've done a very good job for question 4. They haven't even realized that there was question 4 to answer. So now that forces
right.
a lot of companies to actually have protocols for diversity, protocols for early emergency warning for environmental impact, a series of those protocols that might not have been implemented in all mining companies based on the sustainable development goals. So it's a positive. Now, obviously, there needs to be independent auditings. There need to be independent verification on the results. I know some of the mining companies that are in the top 5 or 10 that probably should be in the top 15 or top 20, not top 5 or 10, but are also convinced that they're doing a good job because they see their own result ranked very high in the indexes, and therefore they tell themselves, well, we're doing a fine job. So there's a skewing element here. What we're trying to do to this is that we have a pilot project right now in Colombia where we work with 2 universities in Medellin. I'm mentoring some of their students to go specifically in the gold sector for different, and I think they would call miner in Colombia. They might be surprised when I mention this, but we're doing a first attempt at doing independent monitoring on the same scale, on the same questions as the Responsible Mining Foundation, together with the RGMPs of the World Gold Forum. Consejo Mundial, World Gold Congress, sorry. And so trying to see where would be the discrepancies between the self-reporting and the actual, results from on the ground. And I think that would be interesting if we can, find some with you, the Alliance, other actors that want to be part of it in different jurisdictions to try to develop this. That'd be interesting to try to have a common way to the self-reporting. Obviously, it takes time, but that's the kind of services I think investors should be very interested into trying to support and try to see how we can go from the first step that was the self-reporting indexes to something that might be more independently carried forward by sound.
Yes.
Please.
By the way,
probably, Remi.
Alex,
no, I was just going to add, Andrew, that that's why I think investors increasingly are hewing to the hard metrics. So I think what a lot of folks on the outside don't realize is a lot of these ESG data are actually binary, yes, no, do you have a policy, do you not have a policy on something? And, the investors increasingly are focused on the hard metrics, energy intensity, GHG intensity, obviously everything along CO2 reduction policies, et cetera.
Andrew, do you want to add something?
Well, I was going to mention IRMA, which I think is probably an example. Do you know that this is another mining rating system, which is still fairly new. but it is very much assurance based. So essentially the whole point of the IRMA standards is that they need to be third party audited by an assurance provider, and they're designed in that way. And I think they are therefore extremely robust, and they've also been carefully vetted by a whole range of civil society. The problem with that one is simply it's not cheap. You know, this is like apparently it's $80,000 on average per mine to get IRMA certified. And so this is really going to be skewed towards the larger miners who are going to want to do that, especially for now. Not many mines have signed up. I think they have one in Mexico and one in Peru who's getting this IRMA certification. So it will be, again, a while before that gains traction, but I think that is much closer to what you're talking about as being truly a robust system where you can have a supplier who is processing ore coming from an IRMA certified mine can probably get a price premium, for selling products based on that certification, because it really means something, whereas you couldn't necessarily do that, for other standards.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll link this to a question from Ana Gonzalez. Let me just read it because I think it was interesting. Do you think investors are ready to take into account some of the trends towards a green recovery, like pricing company who can better adapt the transition to a new, more sustainable and equitable economy? What would be the vehicles for investors in the mining oil sector to engage around these issues? To give you time to think about this, let me just address a little bit introductory notes here. Part of our work, and I think where we've done some progress, we still have to make so much more, is addressing the investing communities and even the large banks in New York, so in Europe, to take into consideration the S more importantly when they actually make the investment decision. There's an existing conflict of interest here when you have large banks that encourages companies, their sponsors, to try to make the claim that they are actually not facing too many risks, and there are this very junior miner or this sponsor has to take on the cost of an entire due diligence and double counterparty risk assessment above the ground risk of the ESG. Therefore, as a result, there's obviously a tendency to want to go through the cheapest solution, or one that might be just integrating into the E, as we were mentioning, and others. But there are some moves, there are some changes. I've seen Societe Generale or BlackRock, for example, starting to include inside their quantification for interest rate of their loan an element of social disputes and social conflict, meaning that if there is let's say an uprising among the community, there will not be a discount on the interest rate to repay the loan for the building of the mine. Now, this is just for 5%. This is just for that big headlines and maybe not like a clear understanding of the work that has been done from the mining company or a real assessment of the situation. But it is a step into the right direction, and we're trying to foster and encourage this. Now, obviously, we also have conflict of interest in the sense that pushing companies to do better due diligence. Since we are an intelligence and due diligence company, that makes the sense that we're trying to say that there should be a better work done on the ground. But we're happy to see that there is an evolution, on Avenue of the Americas in New York, for you, Andrew, which probably that's your second home, or in London and in other places, to understand the impact that is caused by supporting a project that is not sound and sustainable. And there's a lot of communications and campaigns against drilling the Amazons, against supporting projects such as Adani in Australia or others. This is just the first step. Obviously, just the big names are being splashed by controversy. But if we're able to expand these tendencies and work with the pioneers into this and throughout the industry, there might be a better inclusion of social, inclusion of project, creation of value into the territory inside the decision from investors to support this decision and try to cut with this conflict of interest of just pushing the bill to the sponsor. So that I'd like to address that question specifically to you, Andrew, because you have the perception from the investor side, your experience at Citi specifically. How can we break this gridlock and try to get a better, more accountable way of assessing the value of an investment based especially on the social dimension and inclusion within the communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is happening. I think the industry is moving in this direction. In the industry, I would say the capital allocation industry. So whether it's the investors themselves, it's also the investment bankers who are involved in attracting capital, and then of course the companies themselves. I think everyone is more aware of these issues than they used to be. So that's a good thing. How do you make this rise even higher up on the agenda? You know, that's definitely kind of hard to know what the secret sauce is, because ultimately everyone is governed by their own personal incentives that exist for them. And so for an investor, so portfolio manager, and we think about this a lot, how are we going to get the actual PM, not the ESG person, sustainability person at Wellington, but the actual portfolio manager to really value and care about this stuff? And the answer is there are two main ways. One is, does he or she really believe that that's going to lead to alpha? So that'll lead to better investment returns by focusing on higher sustainable projects. Or the other way, of course, they're compensated is as a function of assets under management. So they think that they will be able to attract more assets because their underlying investors also value these things more. So those are kind of the two ways. And the good news, as Alex mentioned, is that there is evidence that it's helping alpha. And if you look at fund flows year to date, one of the only asset classes actually has seen inflows is in ESG funds, is like held up better than most other asset classes. So on both of those fronts, the evidence is encouraging. So I think it's good, but how do you accelerate that? Everyone tries to kind of play their role, and including what you guys are doing and what we're doing, playing a role, hopefully, in accelerating that.
I'm thinking about something. Just, by the way, I encourage anyone that has a question just to ask it, because we just have 9 minutes left on the time. We're trying to keep it within 1 hour so that people can continue working afterwards. I remember that made me think about something. When 10 years ago, I was a PhD student, and I was trying to work on incentives within investing companies towards climate change. It was not linked to mining specifically. There was a large, epistemic community led by Joseph Stiglitz that was looking at remuneration basis and compensation basis, salaries and bonuses based on the environmental performance of the asset that we're working for. I was just like a trembling guy, just like trying to edit, Joseph Stiglitz's paper. I mean, at no price at the time. I was in my 20s, imagine that. But there are ideas there. The implementation and moving away from the key ideas to actually having forward companies trying to implement this. We might be able to do it with Société Générale, with BlackRock, with any other. I'm thinking about these because they're moving to that direction. But that could be something to look at. And I'm happy. I mean, we mentioned a series of things that we could do in the near future with the Alliance and AMI specifically, but just to pitch those ideas to those funds. It will not change from one day to the next, but by continuing having the pressure on how there's an individual incentive from each workers inside, those, Van Eck, BlackRock, Orion and others to actually, choose the right investment by making this one element that would weigh on their own remuneration that actually be
it's a really good idea. And it's something which, Climate Action 100 Plus, which is one of these big global initiatives, is that is one thing which they do look at quite closely. They actually asked us to help them engage with a few emerging market, highly emitting companies to try to get to some of these questions. And one of the things they look at is exactly that, remuneration of senior management and middle management also. And I think what they've found is that there is some middle management, but very little senior management, incentives being aligned basically on that stuff. So I think there's definitely more work to be done, but I definitely have not seen much talk of it for the fund managers themselves. So I think that's a super interesting idea and something to be looked into. Just also, I wanted to address Anna's question, and I think it is something we are wondering about a lot. There's a lot of debate among our colleagues at the Alliance, and I think just generally in the community of sustainability, as to whether or not the crisis we're in now will lead to more of a focus on a green recovery, or if that goes all out the window as we try to kind of rebuild the world, and essentially we are going to be forced to relax our standards. And I think it's very mixed evidence about that. But most people I talk to, and I think it's probably true of myself, are fairly optimistic that ultimately one of the key lessons from the pandemic is that we need to be more on top of living sustainably, on this earth. Yeah. And therefore we cannot abandon the green framework and anything. We need to strengthen that. And there was a letter today from science-based initiatives, science-based targets, which is another big organization that had, I think, 50 or 60 big multinational companies signing that, saying, yes, in the recovery, we need to stick to being very focused on sustainability and responsibility. So ultimately, I think it is probably an optimistic message about that, but we will see, because there are challenges.
Yeah, just to address sustainability and mining industry, and then I'll close with the question from Sonia that was just made. What's interesting, we were on sustainability issues in different sectors and verticals, but the point that mining industry really contribute to renewable energies, copper is needed for wind farms and solar panels and so on. That needs obviously to be even more reaffirmed so that it doesn't, there's no strong, opposition between mining and sustainability. There are obviously sustainability issues in mining with any extractive industries. What I'm saying is that obviously, and that's why we try to bring, when we bring academia actors and some, we work with journalists and different, influencers. I don't know if you want to call this like that's the way to be able to really frame the narrative and be able that we actually work on the specific angle and understand the comprehensiveness of the mining sector and sometimes the positive elements of sustainability. I'll go specifically on the question from Sonia, first of all, because I just realized I owe her an answer to an email she sent me probably 10 days ago. And I apologize, Sonia, for not answering. She offered me to address the oil sector in Ecuador, if I'm not wrong. And she actually asked about the impact of gold prices and the evolution of gold prices on probably investment risks. That's a great question for me, because we're actually going to have a webinar on June 4th on what happens if gold prices arrive to 2000 and above, and what impact that will have on security risk, increased money laundering through gold, through informal gold mining, issues of potential resource nationalism, increase of royalties. There are a series of impact that it will have on the mining sector and on the risk that mining companies have to face. But looking specifically at sustainability, if I may ask for you, Andrew, what would a gold price at 2000 and maybe above, if we're looking at speculative tendencies to way above $2,000, how would this serve as either a positive force, an obstacle towards pushing sustainable investment in the gold sector specifically? Would that be a positive driver or potentially an obstacle?
Really good question, and something I haven't looked too much about. I would guess, for obviously that there are forces in both directions on that one, because as you say, there are some of the negative issues that plague the gold sector, such as artisanal mining, for example, and the social impact of that would probably be on the rise. So there's like more incentives to see a lot of informal mining and all of the health risks that come from that, for example. On the positive side, gold mines would, have better funding base, essentially, to allow them to invest in sustainability initiatives. What would all win out? I think it's tough to say. My guess is probably net it would be positive, because I do worry if, taking gold aside and maybe some transition minerals like cobalt or lithium, if you're looking at a challenged economic outlook, you worry about a lot of base metals, of course, and bulks as well, being in a prolonged slump. And I do think that will create real challenges from a sustainability perspective for those miners if they're having depressed prices, marginal profitability, and just less money to go around to support these social initiatives.
No, I think that's definitely something we're going to be researching for the next 2 weeks, as I said, ahead of our June 4th webinar. Andrew already understood that. I'm probably going to give him a phone call on June 3rd, double checking if he has better a larger and more in-depth answer to that specific question. I'll just close this by confirming that every single one of those coffee chats are recorded. They are placed on our dedicated LinkedIn page. So that's why even if we have 300 registrants, we sometimes just have 30 people, because we know it's Tuesday at 11 a.m. It's complicated for anyone. But we're very happy to see how many people download our videos from our LinkedIn and just use it afterwards. Feel free to just communicate with the panelists. Feel free to reach out to us if you have specific ideas. We're obviously under the weather, but my team, I've got some amazing millennials and 20-something and 30-something kids that are working with me, and they will get back to you. And we're trying to be as effective and as useful in this time of crisis and beyond, because there will be a life after COVID-19, obviously. Well,